Okay, so continuing on here, thinking about morality for Kant, that we have this foundation of the goodwill, which is born, in reference to our intentions. That what matters most for Kant are our intentions, and then if we have the right intentions, if we try to act the right way, then hopefully those outcomes will indeed correspond with those intentions. So the basis of our morality, the basis of kind of Kant's moral system, then, is we have the is-ought distinction of thinking about what is the case and what ought to be the case. And from the ought, what it is we do, right, is we kind of form our behavior in terms of the ought, which hopefully have the right intentions. Okay? So if you can kind of think about it like a pyramid or something, and we're working our way up, maybe. You have the is ought, and now we have intentions. And so now what it is we do when we think about our intentions, and I'm going to skip this big half section on this page called deontology. That's something you don't need to worry about. Yeah, you don't need to worry about it. It's fine. So, yeah. So when we think about the goodwill and we think about our intentions, we think about doing what it is we ought to do, right? That kind of just is the way that under a Kantian framework, we kind of start phrasing, start understanding these propositions. We do what it is we ought to do, and so the question is, well, how is it that we ought to act? Okay? Well, what we get from Kant is we get this very particular principle. Really, it's a principle. It's a guiding principle that tells us how it is we ought to act. Okay? And in particular, when we think about that principle then therefore will inform and influence our intentions. It will influence our behavior outwardly. Okay? And in particular, this principle, and I had kind of indicated this in the first video, is more or less the most objective kind of principle that we might encounter all 4 weeks, I guess, because what we have is this measurement that either one is moral or immoral as it relates to this principle. Okay. So we see down here that we should act in accordance with the good will, like doing what it is we ought to do, doing what it is our duty is. That we ought to follow the moral law, which we know a priori. And again, a priori is this ability to know independent of experience, that again, I can know that I ought not murder independent of experience. That I don't need to go out and perform that action to know that I ought not do it. Okay? And that I ought to follow, Kant will say, the moral law. And the moral law for Kant is called the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative. Okay. Now, in the scope of Western philosophy and in the scope of Western ethics in particular, the categorical imperative is one of these kind of seminal signposts of ethical discourse. That there's a lot of writings that have been done in the sake of investigating the categorical imperative, challenging the categorical imperative, or backing up the categorical imperative. Okay? And in particular, this is going to sound similar and probably pretty easy to some of you. Yeah, and we'll cover that here in a minute. But in particular, I think the challenge of the categorical imperative is rich. I think that it's not. I don't think it's wildly easy. And so to that end, we should take it for what it is. Okay? So a singular, a categorical imperative. If someone were to say this is a categorical statement or a categorical imperative, what is one saying is that it is a command without conditions. That it is a command that stands alone, stands independent of any sort of like situational context. Okay? That in particular, It is a command without conditions. And so Kant, and you'll find this in the reading through the BB Learn site, at the top of page 14. Okay, so if you've been working through and kind of reading this excerpt that you have access to, which I would recommend you do so, especially starting on the top of 14, you'll find that, again, it's pretty difficult language at times, but also hopefully some of the ideas shine through. Okay. So Kant thinks that this is the moral law. He thinks that, and he thinks of moral laws the same way that we think of like our daily laws in our lives, right? That we just follow laws, sometimes without question, that they're put in place for a reason, that we don't question them, and that we investigate them. We don't investigate, like we just kind of follow them, right? And Kant thinks the same thing will be true about his moral law, that once we recognize it, once it's elucidated, that ultimately we will be inclined to follow it in the same way that we're inclined to follow other laws. Okay? So at the bottom of 13 he says, but the law is the objective principle valid for every rational being, and it is this principle on which it ought to act that is an imperative. Okay? So for every rational being, and of course that requires a little explication of what constitutes as a rational being, but for every rational being, what it is we get, okay, is this one imperative. There is therefore, Kant writes, but one categorical imperative, namely this. Okay? So all of this has been building up to kind of this statement of how it is one ought to act, how it is one ought to gauge one's morality. One ought to gauge one's morality and one's actions in terms of this categorical imperative that states, act only on that maxim whereby thou canst at the same time will that it should become universal law. Weird language. Okay? Another way, and as you will see in the lecture notes, I've kind of made it a little bit more tangible with regards to the language, but the categorical imperative is to act only on that maxim by which, at the same time, you can will it to become a universal law. Act only on that maxim by which, at the same time, you could will it to become a universal law. So what does that mean? Okay? What does that mean here? Okay. And so from that we need to start investigating what this looks like and what this means. Okay. So first, a couple of like key words in this sentence, and I'm going to work from the lecture notes here. So you should pull those up, or you should have those printed off next to you here. Act only on the maxim by which at the same time you can will that it become universal law. Let's dissect this. What is a maxim? That's a rule, or it's a word that I think needs some further unpacking. What is a maxim? It's a rule or principle. Okay? Don't steal, don't lie, be a good neighbor, right? All of those are various maxims by which one chooses to live one's life. Okay? Always be a good neighbor. Okay? So there's a maxim put in place, a rule or principle by which we're trying to engage with. And another phrase that I think needs to be unpacked is will it to be, or will that it. Okay? When one wills something, one is hoping to see that it becomes the case. Okay? So when we think about a rule or principle, if I say don't steal, right, I'm hoping to see that it becomes the case for who? This is where the idea of universal law comes in. A law that's applied to all humanity, everywhere, at all times, and in all circumstances. Okay? A law that can be applied to all people, everywhere, and at all times. Now that, I think, is the daunting part of the categorical imperative. Because when we try to think of universality of all 7 billion plus people on the planet, right, this becomes a really, really difficult moral proposition. Okay? What if everyone everywhere were doing as I am doing? Kant is saying. Would my behavior change? I think it very well might. Okay, so let's put this into practice here. Let's say, and in particular we'll go with lying. And as you'll see, this is part of one of your response papers at the end of the week, that Kant thought that we have an unqualified duty to always tell the truth. He thinks that lying, is one of the most immoral things that one can actually do, for a variety of reasons. Okay? And working within the categorical imperative, what we see and how this connects is that, let's think about it. If I am going to tell you a lie, okay? If I'm going to tell you a lie, what it is I'm doing is I'm acting on the premise, or I'm acting on the maxim. Trash truck out there. It's very loud. It's very loud. I'm acting on the maxim that lying is permissible if I lie to you. Okay? And essentially what I'm doing, okay? Essentially what I'm doing, if I'm acting on that principle, I'm acting on that maxim, and I say, all right, yeah, I'm going to lie to you. Okay? I'm lying to you. What it is that I'm doing is I'm essentially putting into place that I could will that action of lying to become a universal law, where all people everywhere and at all times lied. And Kant thinks that when we start to investigate things on that level, when I start to think about, okay, well, what if everyone everywhere was doing what I am doing? What if everyone everywhere was lying to each other? Well, the whole institution of truth would be dismantled. We would never know any sort of truth because we would just be operating on the maxim that I'm lying to you. Right? Any sort of honesty, any sort of trustworthiness would just collapse. Because ultimately, if I am lying, and I'm kind of instantiating that that's a behavior that I could will for all people everywhere at all times to do, right? Then ultimately, what we get is we get the corruption of truth. That no truth will ever be known. And so when Kant, what it is he thinks, that ultimately, when we investigate things in that kind of very challenging way, that ultimately from that, what we'll get is we'll be arrived and we'll eventually, right, probably change our behavior. We'll change our intention when it comes to lying. That when we have the inclination to lie, when we have the temptation to lie, that perhaps what it is we'll do is we'll investigate and we'll say, well, no, right? Because it would be self-defeating. It would be a self-defeating thing to do because ultimately it can't be a universal law. Okay? And Kant gives this example in kind of a different way, and this is again in the readings that you all have at your disposal. Okay, so this is on the bottom of page 14, number 2. Okay, he says, another finds himself forced by necessity to borrow money. He knows that he will not be able to repay it, but sees also that nothing will be lent to him unless he promises stoutly to repay it in definite time. He desires to make this promise, but he has still so much conscience to ask himself, is it not unlawful and inconsistent with duty to get at the difficulty of this way? Suppose, however, that he resolves to do so, then the maximum of his action will be expressly thus: when I think myself in need to borrow money, I will borrow money and promise to repay it, although I know that I will never do so. Blah, 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 blah. Is it right? I change the suggestion, blah, 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 blah. How would it be if my maxim were to be universal law? Then I could see at once that it could never hold as universal law because necessity would contradict, but would necessarily contradict itself. For supposing it to be a universal law that everyone, when he thinks himself in difficulty, should be able to promise whatever he pleases, with the purpose of not keeping his promise, the promise itself would become impossible. As well as in the end, one might have to view in it since blah 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 German philosophy. Okay. Essentially, what he's saying here is kind of connecting with this notion of lying. That when one, if your roommate came to you and said, all right, hey Bryce, I'm really sorry, I can't pay rent this month, right? Can you help me out? Can you spot me $400? And you say to yourself, okay, can you try to get the money for me and repay me in a couple of weeks because, I really need that $400. And your roommate says, yeah, not a problem. I got you. Okay? All the while, the roommate knows that she or he is not going to repay you. Right? Maybe they're skipping town, they haven't told you yet, and they're being really shady. But nevertheless, they say, yeah, I promise to repay you. They're lying to you. And so what Kant says about this, that if we are to think about that action of false promising or lying, right, that can't be a universal law. Because ultimately, it'd be self-defeating. We would always be lying to one another, and false promising cannot be something that could be applied to all people everywhere and at all times. And so when we think about this, and when we think about this idea of universality, I think it becomes wildly challenging. Really, really difficult. Really, really challenging. And that when we are left with this idea of thinking about our actions in terms of universality, things become really much more pointed, perhaps, is the right word. Okay. And so I'm going to stop this video here, and we'll move to the next one, which I believe will be our last. But thinking about things in terms of this notion of universality, in terms of what if everyone did as I am doing?